The Special Investigation Unit, SIU, has uncovered a massive fraud scheme involving employees siphoning off billions through manipulated contracts. Joining us to discuss this is Hugo Kruger, a civil engineer and energy analyst. Hugo, good to speak to you as always. Good afternoon. Just walk us through the overview of this scandal. What are the findings from the SIU relating to this R1 billion investigation?
So the SIU, this is an article that was ran in the Sowetan Live, is how I became aware of it. The SIU essentially found that workers in Eskom were basically working late at night and sort of manipulating the tender criteria to siphon off money, and this has now been investigated. So this is sort of a systemic issue, in my view, in Eskom. And personally, I'm kind of glad that there's some level of accountability being taken. Although they say one employer resigned preemptively. And, I just have news for him. If you have committed fraud or anything of these allegations, then resignation does not, exonerate you. You will still be charged and you can still be locked up, if this ends up being prosecuted.
So we understand that the employees were able to manipulate procurement processes, particularly through low-value contracts. How did this actually work?
So this is something, I wrote an article about this almost last year with a man by the name of Siduma Stop. He was a quality engineer at Denel, and him and we're both engineers, and we talked about this. The issue is systemic, in my view. It's a systemic issue so I can't speak to all the particularities of this one because it will still come out. But the issue comes down to the tender criteria. Now, to explain to your audience, there's broadly speaking two ways of doing tenders for engineering equipment, things of that nature. And the first one is we do a competitive bidding. So you get 3 quotations and then you get, say, the best of the 3. And obviously they have to score on some other criteria as well. And another one, which is you choose a technology partner. So I say I'm going to take a technology partner and then I look at what the historical price of the contracts is. And I sort of negotiate to make sure that they're not ripping me off. Okay. And the trouble we've tried to alert to the public is that the government is overdoing competitive bidding. So if you have a highly specialized equipment, OEMs, things of that nature, you won't find 3 quotations all of the time. You might only find 1 or 2 people that can do it. Okay. So then what happens is intermediaries and middlemen are created along the way, who say they are the actual suppliers. And this is how corruption happens. So in my view, it's a systemic issue that is a consequence. And the law I'm attacking is the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, not necessarily the BEE part, which a lot of people miss. It is the fact that it forces competitive bidding on everybody. Okay, and because of this, you have all these intermediaries. There's other things as well, such as mandatory localization laws in South Africa. Now, that sounds great. Okay, we're going to manufacture ourselves, except some of these things are made in China and India. And there is no capacity in South Africa to do it. So you either have assemblies being set up, or you just have intermediaries saying they can do it. And this is the type of corruption that is hampered Eskom and frankly Transnet and all our SOEs.
Now, do we have an idea of the immediate impact of this corruption on Eskom's operations and South Africa's energy supply?
I have no idea how to quantify it because, even corrupt deals at times can have good outcome. Some people have remarked to me in the past, the best corruption is the guy who actually finishes the product on time and on budget, but the price escalates. So I have no idea how to quantify it. Whether it's 10%, the rule that people usually use is the 10% rule. Every contract you can add 10% to it. But you'll have to get an economist to look into it, and then you sit with this other problem. Let's assume there was corruption in a deal, but the guys got the job done. What do you do about that? Okay, so you have to prosecute people, things of that nature.
So Hugo, when we talk about $1 billion, R1 billion worth of corruption, is this the prejudice to the organizations? Is this the prejudice to Eskom? Or is there R1 billion involved in what has been labeled corruption?
Yeah, that's also not clear to me. They say R1 billion was siphoned off. No, it's not clear what siphoned off means. Is that R1 billion on top of things? Is that R1 billion, worth of contracts? Those are two different things, and they need to clarify it. I'm not sure on this one. I suspect that maybe they say there were 334 employees that had financial ties to Eskom's vendors, which is where this thing started. And then 5,464 employees failed to declare conflicts of interest. So already you're seeing in the picture a web of corruption. conflict of interest. Probably, I won't be surprised that people who worked on these tenders ended up working for the vendors, so they have inside knowledge, things of that nature. And then they come with a lump sum of 1 billion rand. Now, 1 billion rand in terms of Eskom's overall revenue and money is actually not a lot of money. So is this a minor thing that has occurred? I don't know. But as I say again, I'm glad that the questions are being raised. And what I would like to see coming from this is that Eskom rationalizes its procurement procedures, okay, to try and avoid it. Because again, as I said before, the root cause to me is the fact that we have procurement regulations that if you were to actually enforce them properly, you would inevitably create corruption because very few vendors can actually meet them. And that is the root cause of this problem. And that is where I point a finger at government regulation. Now, to give a bit more context for your audience, there was a court case won by Sakeliga, I think it was 2018 or 19, my memory now escapes me, against this type of things, that the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act could not be mandated by a minister at that time, and there must have been discretions to SOEs to which to implement it, which made complete sense to me. Because, for example, if we say we want BEE tenders, okay, which is a part of what this comes down to, that makes sense. There's a rationale, there's a localization law for it, on the conditions that the vendor can meet those things. But if you're going to specify things of this nature and mandatory localizations, so it's not just BEE, and there is no capacity in the country to do it, okay, which is about emergency procurement procedures. How many companies can do the emergency procurements? Inevitably down the line, you're setting yourself up for corruption. And that is what I would like to come out of it, is to say, what is the government strategy? First, what is Eskom going to do? Prosecute these people? I'm all for that. But then the question is, you need to look at it systemically and say, did our regulations encourage this type of corruption? And is this a problem only at Eskom level, or is this also a problem at government level? And that is the debate I think that we need to have in the country.
Hugo, you mentioned a number of 5,400 employees, I think you said, who did not disclose a conflict of interest. There are 384, I think that's the number, of those individuals who are directly implicated in this billion rand scheme. Now that's roughly 6,000 employees, which is about 15% of that 40,000 workforce at Eskom, as of figures at the end of last year. Now, that's a significant number of individuals to be implicated or to be talked about in corruption issues.
Yeah, but again, here's the thing. Not declaring conflict of interest doesn't necessarily mean that they were involved in corruption. Okay, we need to distinguish the first thing. It is a lot of people, I agree. They should have declared it, and Eskom should have an ethics policy, which they should have. Everyone who works there should declare your conflict of interest. And also, I want to mention something, your perceived conflict of interest. Okay, because in this industry, I have a lot of perceived conflict of interest. I'll give you an example. I've worked in the nuclear industry. Okay, it's my title. It's obvious when I go on the TV, I say I'm a nuclear civil engineer. So I hope people understand that when I speak of nuclear, take into account there's some bias. That's a perceived conflict of interest. I don't benefit, right, when I get paid. And on the Eskom level, you need to do the same thing. If you work with a coal contract, but your previous employment was working for the guy who was supplying the coal to Eskom, you need to declare that. But the Eskom then needs to manage it to say, okay, wait a minute, this guy worked in the accounts at the last company. We're not going to put him in accounts, for example. And what I would also like to see is when there has been a lot of infograms on the internet going around about Eskom former directors jumping to vendor companies, and they become directors at those companies. So they have inside knowledge. I would like to see a policy that says for 5 years, if you leave Eskom, you cannot go and work for people who supply and benefit from Eskom. There must be something of that nature to close that window. These are the type of policies I think that we need to seriously talk about. And by the way, this is not just Eskom, this is across government in South Africa.
So you're suggesting,
revolving door.
You're suggesting that if you've worked for Eskom, then the likelihood of being implicated in corrupt activities, if you jump to a supply organisation, is relatively high. Is that correct?
It's not necessarily that you yourself will be involved in corruption. It's that you create a perception of corruption. Okay. And then it becomes that thing where the links are just drawn up naturally. It becomes organic. And inevitably you have this thing where the incentives go to where the employee might be. But it's also a case that you have inside knowledge of the organization. Now, we had this issue in the nuclear sector in South Africa for some time where one of the directors, former Nexa CEOs, jumped to people that were supplying equipment, for example, to Nexa. A lot of people raised questions, and then they said, but he's declared it. And I said, wait a minute, even if you've declared it, I'm quite uncomfortable with former heads jumping to supply equipment, for example, to Eskom. There must be a way of managing it. And what I'm suggesting is 3 to 4 years, which is what many countries put in place. You can't do it. The other thing I would like to say is Eskom must come with a strategy to separate competitive bidders from technology suppliers. Companies are the only ones who can do it. And we close the window of competition for every 3 years. Now, that already contradicts government regulations, which is what I would like to change, and saying that every 3 years you renegotiate the tenders. Because if we force only competitive bidding on certain types of contracts, you inevitably have this type of behavior taking place. So there's a lot about an ethics committee that needs to sit down in Eskom and people with expertise in contracting to say, how do we manage and untie these things? I don't personally believe all 5,400 people are guilty of corruption, but I do believe they have not declared a conflict of interest and they have perceived conflict of interest, and they need to declare it now. And we need to say at Eskom, listen, we haven't forced declaration in a while. I'm willing to say to some people, unless they were really involved in corruption, fine. We will overlook it for now for this time because we know all the rubbish and all the crisis Eskom came out of. But from now on, everything is declared. And if you've worked for a previous company, I'm sorry, you cannot work on that contract particularly. You should work on another contract. That's how we manage conflict of interest in any rational organization. And those should be the policies going forward.
Hugo, final thoughts. How involved are external contractors and networks in enabling this corruption, and what can be done to prevent their involvement? I think the penalties, for instance, in some instances, I mean, we talk about Bain and their involvement in various acts of corruption, and the penalties are minuscule compared to the benefits. Look,
well, just ask yourself a basic question: when last did you see anybody getting locked up for any of these type of activities? I mean, eventually as a country, we have to come to a point to say the only way to get rid of corruption is for a few people to be locked up behind bars. Now, the country I like on this is South Korea. They've like 4 out of their last 5 or 6 presidents have been to jail. Okay. Now, that's maybe extreme for South Africa's case. And I'd like to see a few directors of these companies being held responsible, because isn't that the board that should take responsibility? Isn't that, the boards of these companies? And don't tell me they're not aware of it. I mean, because what seemed to have happened with this type of one is that there were intermediaries involved. Now, that's a obvious red flag to me to say, why didn't the company win the tender? Maybe they didn't have all the tick box. Was Eskom's criteria too strict and they knew they wouldn't comply? And therefore, they got these intermediaries to siphon off corruption. And then the other question is, those people working at Eskom or working late night trying to manipulate tender conditions and stuff, what was their involvement in all of this? Where did they get money from? I mean, and also do lifestyle audits on these people, because I spoke to a contractor this morning before coming up here, and he said, well, you know what happened with some of these deals is they go and they say to the person, do you like that car over there? And like, okay, it's like if you work together with us, you can get the car. If you don't work together, we take you out. And they have a semi-mafia activity that was always staked out. Yeah. So, there's a lot of, this is the beginning of a lot of things, but I like the fact, and say this again in public, that there's a little bit of accountability that's coming. I would like to see this mature now in the organization, because we need Eskom to work as a country. I've said this before in this organization. There is no, on this television show, there's no rich country without electricity. So it's a non-negotiable point for all South Africans. Eskom must work as efficiently, as transparently, and as honestly as possible. And I'm not against contractors making money. Entrepreneurs, I'd like for them to engage with Eskom, but on an ethical basis. And this is what we're asking for.
Okay, Hugo, that's where we'll leave that conversation. Hugo Kruger, civil engineer and energy analyst, are speaking to us on the back of the SIU doing an investigation at Eskom on R1 billion worth of fraud.